overthinking, RSD, rumination. If that snowballs, that's essentially what paranoia is.
Joe Perkins and Matt Rackley are back.
Two renowned psychologists.
Breaking down everything about rejection sensitivity dysphoria.
What is RSD in your opinion?
A heightened or amplified extreme sensitivity to perceived or real rejection, failure, humiliation, criticism.
A lot of people say that they feel RSD in their gut. Is there a physiological reason why people feel that reaction in their gut?
There's a psychologist in Columbia University, Edward Smith, who he puts them in the MRI machine and he shows them pictures of their ex. And he compared that then, he put them back in the MRI machine and got them to hold a hot cup of coffee. The same centres that lit up when they were in physical pain lit up when the pictures of the ex were shown. So the brain didn't differentiate between the emotional pain and the physical pain. It was the same. And that's why we feel it.
This episode is dedicated to anyone who is so sensitive to rejection, it feels like a literal punch to the stomach. This sponsored ad was agreed to be 90 seconds long, but because I know most of you have ADHD, I negotiated it down to 89 seconds. I challenge you to test your ADHD by seeing if you can sit still for 1 minute 30 seconds while I tell you about our sponsor, Tiimo app. If I can sit down and record take after take of this message for 2 hours, then I'm sure you can listen to 90 seconds. So here's a short word from our sponsor. Tiimo app is a perfectly tailored app that I use daily, and maybe it's worth you giving it a try to see how it might improve organising your life too. Running a podcast is actually a lot harder than you might think, and juggling all of the moving parts would be near impossible if it weren't for Tiimo app. How? Well, Tiimo is designed specifically to hack the neurodivergent brain, a brain that might struggle with time agnosia, object permanence, memory cognitive load, task initiation, anxiety, or procrastination. All things I'm extremely guilty of too. And how on earth does it help you, Alex? I hear you scream impatiently at your computer or phone screens. Well, the award-winning Tiimo app is the perfect life-hacking tool to help your time management and kick you up the bum when you need it most. If you want to stay ahead of the competition, then the visual planning Tiimo app is specifically designed to help your structuring, organising, focusing, and goal setting. It has a visual timer, providing a tangible and visual representation of time to help users pace themselves so you never miss a deadline ever again. It also has an efficient lock screen reminder service to alert those of you who are very out of sight, out of mind with your chores and afraid you might forget them. It brilliantly centres all of your tasks in one place across devices, both on a web and mobile apps, to streamline your overflowing schedules and make them much more digestible and a lot less intimidating. And for those who find big tasks too overwhelming to even start, Tiimo breaks them down into more manageable subtasks to get the ball rolling. In fact, this app helps me so much that it actually reminded me to record this message to advertise the app. Give it a go. Why not? It might just help. Anyway, back to the episode. Dr. Joe, Dr. Mark, welcome back to ADHD Chatter.
Hey, great to be
you.
here. Yes.
Super excited to chat all things RSD, rejection sensitivity, dysphoria, because speaking to the community, I know that it is the biggest pain point amongst the community. Before we get into the meat of the episode, normally I reveal the guest's ADHD item, but because we've done that with your previous appearances on the show, we're going to do something a bit different, and that is reveal an item that represents something that caused an RSD trigger in me, in my relationship in the past. And I'm going to do that now.
I'm intrigued.
Oh, pancakes.
So that is a frying pan, some eggs, flour, and some milk. And we're going to talk about why that caused an RSD trigger in my relationship a little bit later on. But to start with, I'll ask Joe, what is RSD in your opinion? And Mark, is that your definition of it? And is there anything you'd like to tag on to the end of it?
I know, yeah.
So it's a heightened or amplified extreme sensitivity to perceived or real, actual rejection, failure, humiliation, criticism.
Yeah.
And it's accompanied, when activated, by a visceral response in terms of people talking with me. It's a heightened emotional extreme in terms of proportion to what's happening or perceived to be happening. And it's emotional as well as physical and cognitive in my experience of working with it. So that's, for me, how I would define it.
Yeah. I'm going to give the nerdy answer.
Please do. Yeah, you're going to give the official description, aren't you?
Because I that's how I roll. So yeah, exactly what Joe just said there, totally. But the guy who kind of understood it, William Dobson, was a psychiatrist, and I was reading up a little bit about him because I thought, I'm going to talk about this, and he's been studying RSE for years, and he asked his patients, over the course of your life, have you had consistent problems with sensitivity around being rejected, feeling overly critical, and 99% of his patients says, yes, that's my main problem.
Yeah.
So it's exactly that. It's over the course of your life. It like Joe was saying, it's real or imagined rejection, but also the sensitivity bit is, I think, is the key. It's an acute sensitivity around the perception as well. So it's not necessarily real. It's the perception of, and almost the expectation that I am unlikable, people are going to reject me, I'm going to be abandoned. And as we'll get into it, it's pervasive. So it's not just in one area of your life, it's in multiple different areas.
Yeah. And it's that heightened vigilance, because it's across the lifespan, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, scanning for it.
God, Joe, you used the word visceral there, and it's a word I've used before to describe it. I think it is the only way to describe it if you're just looking at it from the basic. To make someone else understand how it feels is the physiological response. It is visceral, and it can be instant, real or perceived. The tiniest thing can trigger it. I think RSD is very hard to explain, to put into words. Some of your clients, Mark, do you hear similar stories?
Oh God, yeah, totally. Like, I suppose because I see teenagers and adults, so with my teenage patients, yes, there's so much of this around not feeling part of the group, expecting to go to the party and nobody wants to talk to me, or why did they not invite me to that, or big one I hear, which is, and it's I don't know how you get around this one. Snapchat has snap maps. And so if you're on snap maps and you see all my friends are here and I'm not there, and you can see X, Y, and Z are in that space and I'm not in that space, I'm in my house, then the wheels start turning and they deliberately left me out and I'm being excluded. And zero evidence, like no evidence whatsoever, no story, nothing. But just the fact that Snapchat is showing my friends are there and I'm not there. So again, with the sensitivity, we create the stories in our heads. And once we create the stories, we start to believe the stories. And then the stories then have that knock-on effect, which then creates that anxiety, that kind of we're talking about that kind of physical feeling that they have. And again, with some of my young people, like they're in tears. Like they're so upset about this because they really believe they're being left out. Yeah.
Social media, I think, is so damaging. You raised one example there. I think just generally, you could be scrolling Instagram, very happy on your sofa at home, having a pleasant evening, and you see a picture of a group of friends out on a night out and you're not included.
Yeah.
And, I don't think it's healthy, is it, to be exposed to that kind of awareness. But there's a lot of ignorance in blissfulness and ignorance. RSD, for me, is by far the worst part of ADHD. And I reflect on sort of what triggers me. And I think it's when it's aligned to something that is I intrinsically believe to be true or a part of my character. If it's something that I'm not really bothered about, Like if I do a science exam and I get a criticism from the teacher to say that I didn't do very well, that doesn't trigger me because I don't care about science. I know that's not what I'm good at, but I have to do it because that's part of school. If I'm recommending a film, like one of my favorite films, to a friend or my partner, and they get up to use the loo, and I say, shall I pause it? And they say, no, don't worry. Because I've aligned that film to my personality, and it's almost like an extension of my worth and what I'm interested in. And them shunting the film is essentially them saying that something that I'm trying to add value into your life isn't good enough. And it kind of reinforces that internal monologue that I have that I'm not good enough. And that's what causes trigger, the little things, the little indications.
The things that somehow have become connected as part of you in your mind.
That's a bit like it's personal because it's part of your self-identity. So like, because you're so emotionally involved with that and that's so meaningful to you, and then you've emotionally invested in that, then I often think with RSD it's like it's the death by 1,000 cuts. Like it's the wound, and every wound wounds you more. But then sometimes they are the big wounds where you actually are being rejected, or it's something very, very obvious. But a lot of times it isn't. It's the very small things like what you described, Alex, but every time it wounds you, and you end up with all this wounded material, which then creates an even bigger wound. So therefore, and I think that's part of sensitivity. The wound never heals. It's always kind of open, and so the reaction, the response is so immediate, but you're basically being wounded by stuff that's going back years.
And the interpretation that you've put on it quite often, as you say, those small things that aren't rational. Because I think most people have the FOMO thing. You don't want to think you haven't been invited to the party. But it's the extent to which you run with that and what you tell yourself the truths are and the reasons behind that are.
The narratives.
And obviously, the RSD is that you're at fault. You're not good enough. And it's, you say, very personal. It's very, very painful.
Joe, why does the ADHD brain cause RSD?
I don't know if it causes it as such, but it's definitely, they're very closely aligned. It's very common in people with ADHD. It's the emotional dysregulation that happens. So you're going to have an extreme, perhaps, or heightened, inflated response to things just because of the way the brain is wired. Also, I think it's that ability to just kind of scan and not cut things out. That, again, your brain's capturing stuff as an ADHDer, that it's not filtering out. So it's processing at speed. So I think that, again, really lends itself to capturing things that may or may not be there at speed. You don't really know why. So you're not slowing down to verify the incoming. But then also you've got this ability to hyper-focus. So if something happens, and then as a young child, you then start picking away at it. So I think there's a few different kind of executive function features that mean that it's so prevalent.
Dr. Nerd here. They don't know what causes it because because even with ADHD, we kind of really don't understand. We understand what it is, but we don't really understand the why. But just what Joe was saying there, because you've got the prefrontal cortex is compromised in an ADHD brain, then that is responsible, like Joe was saying, for the emotional regulation. So what we seem to think is that being able to kind of regulate the feeling, because with RSD, obviously it's an overreaction. It's an overly emotional response to something very small, because the context and the emotional response don't match. So we seem to think that that's part of the problem, which is the fact that the emotional regulation is problematic because the prefrontal cortex isn't regulating that response sufficiently. So what you get is a response which is massively magnified, because that part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, that says, would you just calm down? That's fine, isn't actually telling you to calm down. The other part of your brain, your limbic system, is screaming, and then your prefrontal cortex can't keep up with that. So you get the kind of tsunami of emotion, the overreaction, because the prefrontal cortex isn't able to kind of say, would you be quiet?
guests on this podcast and other people I've spoken to in the community, they report feelings of intense sadness or intense rage, whether that comes out externally or whether they internalize it and they shut down. Do you think there is a sort of a range of emotions that you would associate with an RSD flare-up that you might not associate with rejection?
I think one of the big ones is insecurity. So it literally preys on. I mean, everybody has their own insecurities, but and they're very personal to us. But with the RSD, the person they're racked with insecurity because what's being played out is that the insecurity is now being triggered. And of course, when you feel insecure, you feel vulnerable, you feel scared, you feel afraid. So all of those things are kind of kicking off. And I think one of the other things is, one of the kind of other ones that I see is jealousy. So jealousy is all about loss and feeling jealous that, well, like, why can't I just do it? Why can't I just not react? Why can't I be like other people? So it's that jealousy around, well, there's a problem with me, and being jealous of others that don't seem to have the same difficulties you have.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I think I think there's it can happen, kind of, some people will have one theme that really activates for them, whether it's the rage, the jealousy, but the embarrassment and humiliation.
Definitely.
Because again, we're trying, certainly the adults that I'm working with, they are by definition functioning, successful, operating in a world where people seem okay and not, so it's often a very internalized state, whereas obviously sometimes with teenagers it's kind of more out there and it may feel it's not less intense, but so there's this real disconnect between what people are seeing around a boardroom and then you're feeling mortified that you are going through this and you think if anyone actually could see it, then you feel very, very exposed, vulnerable. But yeah, it's the humiliating element.
Definitely.
And the jealousy as well being, my life would be so much better if I didn't have this, because they are free, they being anyone that isn't experiencing this. Because of course, people don't realise that lots of people, certainly ADHDs, are experiencing this, but when we're masking, we're obviously not showing that if we're in certainly a professional setting. It may look like something else.
Yeah, absolutely.
You wouldn't go, oh, that's RSD.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of shame.
The shame piece is huge, isn't it? Because I think, particularly with these reactions to criticism and rejection, the older you get, you sort of feel like you should be able to handle your emotions. And particularly in relationships, if you do have that shutdown, or you do give into that impulsivity and you shout something that you didn't mean, but you sort of let the RSD win in that moment, and then you've got to communicate that with your partner, which is all of the advice I've heard from people I've had on this podcast is stop. If it does play out, let it play out, then take a break, observe what happened and communicate so you can understand it in the future. But what comes with that is a huge amount of shame, having to communicate with your partner that this is something that you don't have a handle on. Do you have any advice, I'll ask you, Mark, for someone who's perhaps in that very specific situation where they have RSD playing a part in their relationship, they have been triggered, they have internalized it, they've shut down, and they're trying to approach their partner and communicate what happened in a way that, how can that person alleviate some of the shame that comes with that scenario?
Well, I think that first of all, it's to recognize that the shame, to validate the feelings. So the shame is valid. However, like all feelings are not facts, they're feelings. So they're giving you information, but not necessarily giving you accurate information. But you've got to listen to the feeling. But I think it's very important if it's you, Alex, or whoever, that person needs to kind of do that piece first, which is to recognize, okay, there's shame here, right, fine. But the shame isn't valid because I haven't done something shameful. I'm feeling shame. But the reason I'm feeling shame is because that's a familiar feeling. That's something that my brain has stored over the course of all these experiences and it's the associated feeling. However, that isn't a valid representation of what is, I haven't done something shameful. So what that does is that then helps your brain then to kind of start to reformulate what's actually happening. And then the next piece of that is, and when you're communicating that, is to shift from, okay, what happened here? So you shift from the feeling to the facts. And the facts are like, again, and I always think like, I like to bring humor into things because sometimes these things, they are ridiculous. They're literally ridiculous. and it's not like you're like trying to embarrass the person, but humor actually helps to see it in a completely different light, which is it's laughable because what you've got is a kind of moment of madness and all these feelings kind of kick in, but none of it is representative of what's actually happening in the moment. It's all projected. So I like to use humor, yeah. And if it's appropriate humor, then laugh at yourself, have your partner laugh with you and talk it out and kind of have a bit of a giggle about it and move on. Yeah. Humor is great because it releases all the dopamine and the nice endorphins. So it literally is a neurological chemical change as well. Where because the other thing with RSD too is like because it's so overwhelming, it's all very serious. And it's very hard to laugh at yourself because you're kind of tortured. But actually, it's remembering like that, again, it's not reflective of you. So if you can bring that humor in, it can just help to dilute it a little bit.
And it's interesting, it's that sort of deep separating it from the personal as well by doing that, because that's the RSD. Yeah. It's this thing that happens and that I do, but it isn't me. But
some of my teenage patients, we give it a name. Like we actually name it. So when it's RSD, like we give it a name of, oh, this is blah, 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 is in the room, or blah, 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 is it kind of in my head? And so and by naming it, like the reason for that is because it externalizes it as this is something that's happening it's not me. It's something my ADHD brain is so he or she is present or it is present, but it's a visitor. It's something separate.
The humour piece is great advice, actually. And I do reflect on things that have triggered me in the past. And when you're in the moment, it's obviously not funny at all. Far from it. You are completely shut down, filled with rage. But you retrospectively look back and you just think, like, what the hell was I doing?
How did I make that conclusion from that experience?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's the perspective, isn't it? When you zoom out. Yeah. And the zooming out is quite often the time after the event when you can go, how did that make me feel like that? But in the moment, you don't have the perspective because it's just activated in you.
It's
all because you're scanning, it's all these variables that you don't know are there consciously coming together.
Goes back to that word
setting
visceral.
A bomb off.
That goes back to that word visceral, in the moment. Nothing funny about that, but afterwards there is humour. I like that.
And you said this, Mark, but I know that for me, I want to underline that when it's appropriate, because I think sometimes people can be quite clumsy with it, and it can be, and this is where it can be hard to say this for a partner or someone working with a colleague. You might have a great friendship, and if they happen to know, and if you've confided, be cautious. I think we have permission when we're in the room with someone, because there's the trust, the confidentiality when you're in a relationship where there is trust, and they're not kind of playing with, if you're in a healthy relationship. Which, of course, a lot of people with RSD aren't necessarily, because for all sorts of reasons. So, I know you said that, but I think it's really important we underline. I think some people could try and use it outside of the sort of appropriate, and that would just be devastating, wouldn't it?
Well, and the humour is not like, it's not insulting. So you're not, exactly. It's your, it's totally taking the moment and basically you're reframing it.
And it's, as you said, laughing at the RSD and the situation, not the person. Exactly. And that is very powerful. It's like taking the monster out from under a bed when a child's scared. It's like, lights are on. Of course, there is no monster, but it's like, everything, it just kind of takes the power away.
Yeah, totally. Fascinating. Yeah. You made me think of the item on the table in front of us, and thinking about looking back and thinking of finding humour in triggers, because I look back at what I'm about to explain and I just cannot believe like what happened. And it is hilarious, but at the time it was far from hilarious. I remember the feeling. And on the table in front of me is a frying pan, essentially ingredients for pancakes. And that's the heart of the story. There's a handful of things I think I'm okay at in life. And one of them is making pancakes. Throughout my entire childhood, I enjoyed making pancakes. I loved Pancake Day. And a couple of years ago, I decided to make pancakes for my partner. And I was making the mix. And I put the milk and the eggs together, and I mixed them all together. And then once that was all mixed, I added the flour, and I was stirring it all. And my partner said to me, "You've done the mix in the wrong order. You're meant to put the flour in first, and then the eggs and the milk, and mix it all together." Now, in that moment when she said that, that was the night ruined for me. Something inside me went from having a fantastic evening, really looking forward to making my partner pancakes, showing how what I thought was one of my skills was making pancakes, and that little comment, which was essentially correcting what I thought I was something that I was good at, and it inflicted a sort of a pain inside of me. It ruined the whole evening. And I look back now, and it's so ridiculous. Like, how can something so small, a tiny correction to the way I was making pancakes, take me from 10 out of 10 euphoric good mood to internalized rage and sadness and shutdown? How can I explain that to myself?
And you can even see, recounting it, knowing it was ridiculous, there's a physical twitching, very minor, but, it's that tale, isn't it? It's that, like, from life. Obviously, the pancakes, particularly from your childhood, I probably have quite resonance. My hunch would be as well, I pull the thread off when I'm with my clients, and I'll kind of go, what else was happening earlier in the day? The pancake thing could have always stung, but it could have happened on another day, and it may not have evoked such a volcanic RSD reaction that ruined your night. And I know that I don't have your clients where sometimes I go, why was it that meeting that really set that off? But the one that was really challenging 2 days before with the same person on the same project didn't. And then when you pull that thread, you'll find, there are multiple things that perhaps you hadn't noticed over the day, or other things you're worrying about. And then in combination, because you haven't tuned in, that moment is the thing that makes you feel criticized, rejected, deep down. I mean, I don't know. It may be different for different people, but
It might be essentially the straw that broke the camel's back, like a culmination of things
it
throughout
can
the day.
be. I mean, on a pancakes, there are things. No, because sometimes there are things that will consistently trigger an RSD. Like if you don't return my messages or calls, or I see you out with someone else, they can be fairly consistent across different friends. But something like that, if it feels like you could have had that criticism another time, I think there may have been other bits perhaps going on.
It's hilarious. I mean, I'm sort of laughing to myself now, but the knock-on effects of that and other RSD episodes in my life sort of create a fear of encountering that trigger again. Like if I'm in a restaurant and pancakes are on the menu, obviously it doesn't trigger the same response, but it kind of snaps me back to that event, and it makes me not to the same degree, but it makes me well up a little bit and shut down to a smaller scale. So it almost creates like this fear of encountering the memory of the event as well.
But that wasn't about pancakes. That moment was not about pancakes. No. Yeah. That was the trigger, but it was all, like Joe was saying, it was all the other stuff. Maybe you had other stuff in your mind, or you had high expectations, or there was other stuff happening there. The pancakes was just a trigger, but all the other stuff, and it's not even sometimes even conscious, landed in that moment. Because again, if you look at what happened, the context on your reaction didn't match. So there's a big gap there. And it's all the stuff in the gap is the stuff that's actually going on. But you don't necessarily catch that because you're in feeling. And when we're in feeling, we're not in rational mind. So we're not thinking clearly, we're thinking with our feelings. And then our feelings help us then to understand the moment. So while you're in that heightened emotional state, your focus would have been on that, the trigger, but that was just the focus of the feeling, but the source of the feeling was something completely different.
And that is often why people will say, I don't understand why. Because you're naturally, you want to understand why, so you can avoid it, learn something about yourself. But you often don't get the answer from the pancakes because is so many layered elements, historical as well as recent, over the last sort of 48, 72 hours or even few hours. But it's also, again, then when you get triggered by that, when you see the pancakes, it's like a smell or a piece of music evoking something, because it's like a stamp on your brain. And actually with negative experiences, we're wired from an evolutionary perspective to be tuned in to fearful events so we can avoid them. But the pancakes are kind of a message to your brain. This could be a dangerous thing, and it's all happening very quickly, and you know rationally it's not, so you aren't. But it's like it stamps something on you, doesn't it?
It's an emotional event now.
Yeah, it was
your
instant.
brain is going to store it.
And it was, visceral, like going back to that word, and it lasted about an hour, and then it was gone. It was fine. I think the awareness to not to lash out and say something nasty in that hour when you are in that seeing red phase is the biggest lesson I've learned from doing this podcast, is to recognize the feeling, recognize the trigger, and just get away from it. Go be in a place on your own, regulate, calm down, and then you can approach it with a clearer head. Because actually I find from experience, if you do say something in that moment, you can be really nasty.
Oh yeah.
And that stays.
Well, because you're in a defensive state, but that's a McFly moment. That's all about you.
Love the reference.
Yeah.
Do you think there's some common social interactions, Joe, that people might experience day to day that could cause RSD that a neurotypical person would not understand or not be affected by?
Yeah, I mean, risk of being sort of like so general, it could almost be anything. I mean, things that some people will share with me, things like someone not seeing them down the corridor at work and assuming what's going on, I've been ignored. Seeing two people in a meeting room, they're whispering, obviously about me. Again, McFly moment. But actually, it could be about many other things. But again, you can think about it. Someone asking you for instructions or directions and not knowing how to give them can make you feel embarrassed, shameful, complete stranger. But I know people can get triggered by things like that. The being like a friend changing plans because they can't make it.
Classic one.
That is like such
Volcano.
potential for, but I'm obviously not important, but they can go out tomorrow night, which isn't necessarily anything to do with why they couldn't see you.
Someone replying to a text message with
I
a
was going
thumbs
to say
up.
classic when they left me unread. Okay.
Or they didn't. What do they mean when they've written this in that email?
Text
I mean,
message,
or another thing I will say is, I spent a load of time on that report. Someone will say to me, I could tell they didn't like it. They being someone that's read it. It's like, well, they may not have had a chance to read it. They may actually be thinking about it. They may not like it. But the quick jump to lose my job, I won't get that promotion, and it can just cascade into all sorts of catastrophizing. But again, the feeling in that moment just blocks everything out, and it can be, terrifying.
Why does that happen though, Mark? Like if you do get a text message, if you text a friend and they reply, it's a bit of a relatable joke, but I'm curious to know what's going on. If someone replies with a thumbs up emoji or replies to an email and puts a full stop at the end of the paragraph, like these are all real scenarios that I've heard people report to cause this RSD trigger. In those, you could argue, irrational stimuli to emotion. Why is that triggering a full stop at the end of an email?
Again, I think you got to take a step back. So remember, with the rejection sensitivity dysphoria, I want to pick up on that word dysphoria because that the meaning of dysphoria is difficult to bear. So if you've got some, you got that it's difficult to bear. It's difficult to bear the feeling. It's difficult to bear the understanding. So there's a difficulty kind of bearing all of that stuff. So if you think about holding on to that, then that will project itself onto anything. So if you're in that kind of space where you're in general finding it difficult that day, if you're in a kind of a vulnerable space or you're anxious I think with this particular piece, you're all up in your head. So if you're all up in your head then, and your head isn't stable, then that projected piece will land itself onto anything. So it will be a full stop. It will be a thumbs up. And on another day, that wouldn't knock you. You'd be able, that wouldn't, because you're not in that moment, because your head is stable, or you're not feeling particularly sensitive. But if your feet, and you'll only know it when you're in it. So you can't predict, oh, this falls. You can't predict it. You'll only know it when you're in it, because that's the moment where it presents itself. So like when I'm working with RSD, like obviously you got the obvious ones, but if my patients come in and say, oh, well, it was that, then I go, okay, well then, okay, that's the trigger. But like you never focus on the trigger. You have to focus on the psychology of what's happening in that moment that led you to that understanding, or that's how you interpreted that. So, you know, because if I was just thinking about your pancakes, like if a patient came in to me, I'd never sit and talk about pancakes. Like I'm not, because that's not the issue. You have to go behind it.
RSD in relationships, Joe, the clients you see, aside from stories of pancake mix, do you see RSD causing problems in relationships? And what is the solution for that scenario?
Well, I would say there are many scenarios that can come from it. So yeah, I mean, if RSD is going to be problematic for the person experiencing it, and therefore their partner and family members potentially. But I think that it plays out in my experience, and I also do couple therapy, so I kind of see it play out in a range of different ways. And if I had to sort of do some categorization, which of course there's lots of variation within, I'll find that people can often choose a life partner or a relationship based on protecting themselves from being rejected. So they may choose a partner consciously or unconsciously where they feel safer because that person won't leave them, because maybe they're more successful, more beautiful, more whatever than their partner perception-wise. So that gives a sense of security and therefore avoidance of the rejection. So it can affect things in quite indirect but very profound ways. There can be a sense of, well, they chose me, so
I'm special.
I'll it must be okay, rather than even asking yourself, do I fancy this person? Do I enjoy their company? Do I respect them? Do we have similar values? And then obviously if you're in the relationship, it could make a healthy relationship. It can be very difficult to discuss certain things at certain times because your partner, if they're not someone that's RSD or understands it, the landmines are potentially everywhere. Like, why is today the thing I did? Like,
I did that yesterday and you didn't react.
I've done that so many times, and now you're wanting to kind of like leave me because of it, or you're in a floods of tears, and that's where it's not about that.
Yeah.
But I also think as well, one of the more kind of really worrying things, apart from the first two, is when, because RSD can lead to real people pleasing and going to such great lengths to overcompensate, it can lead to very sort of unhealthy work relationships, because I'll get a lot of people that I've worked with over the years where they'll say, I had a boss that was amazing. They thought I was great, so I did more and more and more. Whether they were asked to or not, you get a manipulative boss or someone who's prepared to take advantage of that. You get burnout, you get a real loss of being able to validate yourself, which is a big part of the RSD anyway, being able to go, objectively, I think I can do that well. So you can get people that really prey on people that would people please. And to diminish someone with low confidence even further, you're in really scary territory there, aren't you, psychologically, Mark? You know, again, the narcissistic stuff and the vulnerability and the abusive relationships, coercive control, which anyone can succumb to. An RSD person is more potentially vulnerable because you'll reject me if I don't do.
It can also lead, absolutely, Joe, codependency. So you can end up in a codependent relationship, which is bad news.
Do you think RSD, do you think there's a difference in how it manifests, presents throughout someone's life, i.e. how they experience it in their childhood compared to how they experience it in their adulthood? Mark? Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I think like certainly because I work with the teenagers, like teenagers they're quite tribal. This is well documented in many TV shows and movies. But because they're quite tribal, then in order for you to work through where do I fit in and what gives me protection and what gives me security, then you kind of need to find your people and find your tribe. So what I see with sort of my young people with the RSD is they almost become obsessed with their friends. I mean, really obsessed, where they have to be checking social media constantly to make sure that they're connected. They don't want to go on family holidays because they're missing parties or events. And what I hear all the time is, I'll be forgotten about when I get back. Well, you're only going for a week. Probably, I don't think that's going to happen. But again, in the mind of the young person, that's like that week is a week too long.
It's a really risky situation
Totally,
by the sounds of it.
And they're like negotiating with the parents, can we go for 3 days? And and the parents are like, no. But in the mind of the young person, it's literally like it's far too risky to be out of the scene because people are going to move on and you're going to be left behind. So I see that all the time. And also the kind of fear of missing out. So kind of missing that party, missing that even like not going for lunch with their friends at school. Then they everything is risky, everything. So they have to be over connected to feel safe. And of course, that can cause huge problems because the reality is life doesn't work like that. And also we have to do a lot of work on navigating that because you're not going to be able to control that the whole time.
What about the sexes, Joe? Do you think there's a difference in the way someone is triggered with RSD depending on their sex?
I think it can look sometimes gendered, but not necessarily. I see it much more nuanced. I find it very, very personal and individual. So, yeah, arguably there will be people that if their fear of being rejected because of how they look is their thing, amongst others, or something they feel they can fix, you may find that females, but not exclusively females, just to be clear, may do certain things, tweaks, surgeries to kind of try and create, a more idealized version. But again, men do that. I think it's much more nuanced than that. And you may you'll get. I will talk to some men and they'll be like, but I should be strong in these situations. I shouldn't, so there will be gendered, socialized views and beliefs, but I should be successful. So my friends are successful. They've got the car or they've got whatever, and that may be more, maybe less so now, prevalent for some men. And again, it's the socialization. So it can differ between cultures as well. Totally. And so it's multifactorial in my experience. But yeah, it can have a gendered manifestation. But I think actually behind closed doors, I don't see much of a difference. Yeah. There can be a hormonal feature. So with people's, as a woman, as a cycle, at certain times of the month, you will feel more sensitive generally and maybe feeling more vulnerable. So that can really trigger the RSD hormonally. So that would be gender, but it would look perhaps the same behind closed doors, and the impact is the same in my experience.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think picking up on what you said there about the blokes, the thing I see with the lads is they obviously are incredibly sensitive and are maybe more prone to having an initial emotional response. And what I see is a lot of masking, because if you're with a bunch of lads and there's all the laddie banter and there's all the nothing to see here around mental health and feelings, then there can be a huge amount of masking from the guy to try and be that version of the bloke that's the bloke in the rest of the group. So kind of what I hear is, like, I was working really hard to not kind of show my feelings, or to, like, when I was being triggered, I didn't want the guys to see that really affected me. So there's a huge amount of, and then linked into that too, like there can be using alcohol to cope. So you're trying to kind of then chemically calm yourself down. So I certainly think that's the stuff I hear from my male patients when we're talking about this particular thing. Huge amounts of masking and sometimes self-medicating because they don't want to be seen to be that sensitive guy in the group, which is who they are actually. Yeah.
In that situation there, you said, looks like a group of lads out, or any social situation. When someone is triggered in a social situation, do you think visually to everyone else in the group that event is obvious, Joe?
I think it would be very, it depends how good the masking is, I think. And you know,
great actors.
Yeah, I think the person being triggered will feel it's evident and be working very hard, hence the shame and the, like, because you're in your head by that point, you know. Totally. But and sensitive people, and I don't mean in the RSDs, but people that kind of emotionally feel, there'll be friends that will say, they might have a word later, and I know people will share that, and I can think about that with my own children, again, not even linked to the RSD thing, but I think sometimes it can be pretty obvious, but sometimes you wouldn't. I think it's,
definitely.
Hard one to answer.
It's a hard one to answer. I think what you do tend to see is when that guy is maybe on their own at the end of the night, or they're on their way home, or they go back to their partner, whatever. That's when it all kicks in. Yeah.
A lot of people
which is unfortunate.
Say that they feel RSD in their gut. Is there a physiological reason why people feel that reaction in their gut?
Yeah. Simply, yeah. Like it's, and they've done studies on this. So, and nerd alert. There's.
I like having a resident.
I know. You can see what my patients go through. Here he goes again. Give me all this stuff. There's a psychologist in Columbia University, Edward Smith, and he did a study where he put 40 people in an MRI machine and showed them pictures of, these people had been selected because they'd been recently rejected by an ex. So he puts them in the MRI machine and he shows them pictures of their ex and watches what happens in their brain.
Sounds like torture.
No, yeah, kind of cool. I thought that's really sad. But they signed up and probably signed disclosures. They probably got paid.
Yeah. They consented. It's okay.
Yeah, they consented. Wasn't like dodgy psychology science. And what happened was the parts of the brain that you'd expect, the emotional parts, lit up, but also the parts of the brain that deal with physical pain lit up. And he compared that then, he put them back in the MRI machine and got them to hold a hot cup of coffee, which of course was quite painful. And what he noticed is that the same centers that lit up when they were in physical pain, like no pictures of the ex, it wasn't an emotional reaction, lit up when the pictures of the ex were shown. So the brain didn't differentiate between the emotional pain and the physical pain. It was the same. And that's why we feel it. It's physical pain. Like the brain doesn't differentiate. The pain is real. And the brain is actually responding to the emotional pain in a very physical way. So we have the science to back this up.
And it's all connected, isn't it?
Totally.
You know, this is part of the system, yeah.
Is there a link between RSD and rumination of thoughts?
Yes, there's definitely, I mean, if you have RSD, you will definitely ruminate. But I also think...
If you have ADHD, you'll definitely ruminate.
I was going to say, for me, it's not the RSD, the rumination. For me, it's the ADHD rumination. Yeah. And because I know, and you'll have this, Mark, I don't doubt, I'll have clients that are ruminating on things that aren't actually RSD.
No.
They'll be going, I can't get over replaying that thing or that trying to fix a problem or the things I've got to do. And it genuinely isn't linked to fear of failure. I mean, they might have that as well. But so I think the rumination is the feature, and the fact that RSD is so high in terms of the likelihood that you'll have it if you've got ADHD. That's why they're so inextricably linked. Because it will land on that. Because that is
triggers each. Yeah. They'll trigger each other. Yeah.
Mark, I've read reports online that their RSD can sometimes be so severe and so visceral in the moment that the person experiencing that intense pain in that moment can have suicide ideation.
Yeah.
Can RSD be so bad that very occasionally in that moment someone could take that terrible decision?
Yeah. Yeah, and that might seem quite extreme to think, well, obviously that's a big leap. from maybe something that isn't so kind of horrendous that you would think would bring somebody to feel so hopeless they take their life. But yeah, like you touched on it earlier, where with the RSD, it can go one of two ways. It will be externalized or internalized. So if it's externalized, you get the RSD the ADHD rage, where all the feelings are kind of coming out and they're kind of like, they're all kind of very, very messy. But that's not everybody. If it gets internalized, then the person's gone in and now they're kind of trapped inside their own heads. And the difference is with suicidal ideation, you see that, say, if I'm treating a case of, say, depression, then you see that because the person has a diagnosis of depression, and it's one of the symptoms where the depressed brain can make the person feel very hopeless, and it's hard for them to see kind of a future worth living. So the suicidal ideation kicks in. But interesting enough, with RSD, you don't have that trajectory. It's very quick. It's very, very quick. The feeling is so intense. And so the person can become very hopeless very quickly. So it's not a gradual thing. It's very fast. And if they can't kind of regulate the feeling, because that's the issue, if they can't regulate the feeling, then they can't regulate their thoughts. And then the knock-on effect of that is then regulating the behaviors becomes a problem. So absolutely, that it can lead that person to dysregulate so much that they will start to dysregulate so much in their thoughts that it can lead to the dysregulated behaviors. So it's not dramatic to say that. It's very real. And again, if we bring in the other piece, which is the impulsivity part of ADHD. So again, like, we never look at one thing in isolation. That if we bring in the difficulty with kind of managing impulsivity, then it can be the perfect storm, literally. And that person can be in a very risky place very quickly.
Yeah. And it goes to that point of it won't, with RSD, anyone that understands it, it is that layering. And it's not like you just wake up one day and then that event made you feel triggered. Yeah. The whole thing has been building up, and different people have different thresholds to that,
yes.
and different kind of environments that they're in, and different things that their heads do, as well as
sober, maybe got all those things that makes it out. They're taking drugs.
And other kind of other mental health issues that can also clearly be comorbid with ADHD specifically, but also just occur.
Joe, I imagine all humans are probably sensitive to rejection. Do you think there is an evolutionary reason or an evolutionary advantage why somebody might focus on the negatives?
I mean, I think there's probably a number. We know that we perceive and experience negative things, images, tastes, pain or sensations more deeply, richly. It activates different aspects of our brains. You may know which ones, Mark, I don't know, but like there's more to it. It's richer. No, but you know, it does a whole different thing. So whilst pleasurable experiences will release some dopamine and be nice, they're not having the cascade and culmination of events. And it's probably for survival. I mean, we do not want to eat the poisonous plants. We do not want to repeat something that puts us at risk. Like, the conditioned taste aversion. If we get sick with one thing, it often isn't that thing that made us sick, but we won't be able to eat the thing that we ate last because it's our brains kind of priming us. Also, when we think about survival in a tribe, a pack, and from an evolutionary perspective, you do not want to be cast out of that because you're vulnerable. So there's an advantage being able to read the room, as it were, or the forest or wherever you are. Go, I'm going to make sure I stay in this.
Yeah, for protection.
And you be valuable as well if you're someone that can spot signs. But again, that hypervigilance around what's the mood, who's the next leader going to be, who do I need to align myself with, who could cast me out. I think there's very good reasons why we may be primed to do it. And it's a pretty consistent feature, isn't it?
Definitely.
That negativity. I can't remember, there's a study where they'll show lots of negative words, neutral words, and positive words, and the recall is even just words. So forget imagery or something you've taken, and you'll always have a consistently way higher recall on negatives. So again, it's universal, global. We're primed and wired to. So I think what you then do with that will differ from person to person.
I want to do the ADHD agony aunt section, which is called the washing machine of woes, because my ADHD item is a washing machine because I always leave my laundry in the machine. I'll ask you, Joe, first. Do you leave your laundry in the machine?
It has been known.
Yeah.
It has been known, yeah.
What about you, Mark?
I'm pretty good with that only because I'll annoy myself if I do that.
Yeah.
And I annoy myself on a regular basis anyway. So I try not to. Yeah. So, and I also know as well, I'll just have to do it again, which will really annoy me.
Oh, yeah.
Brilliant. Although I have to say, I am getting a bit better because I'm using the Tiimo app and I've written it on the top to remind me to say the sponsor of the show.
Clever.
But yeah, basically every week I ask my Instagram community to give me one of their ADHD woes and I put it in the washing machine and I read it out to see if there's some wisdom from the guests. So I'll come to you first, Joe. This week in the washing machine of woes, someone's written in and asked, thinking about things gives me a dopamine hit, so I fall into a bad habit of looping and looping the same thoughts over and over again. Is it normal to rethink negative things over again? Why are they giving me a dopamine hit? And how can I stop this?
There's a lot in that question, so
There's a lot,
thank
yeah.
you for the question.
You want to read it? I'll pass that to you.
I think, so it's normal for people that have a brain wiring that loops. It can feel like someone that doesn't, it's not going to be normal for. So I think it's normal. I think that the dopamine hit, I'm not so sure about that being something that I would recognize, but obviously it's something that the question asker's experiencing. And I'd say there's something we go back to problem solve when we don't have an answer. So with RSD, we often can't make sense of it because as we were talking before, we're trying to focus on the trigger and try and make sense. Why did the pancakes or the other thing that's in your life triggered you? And of course you can't solve it. So you keep going back to try and solve it. So that is why that's happening. And I think that can feel soothing while it's lasting. It obviously doesn't solve anything. So it almost makes it worse.
Yeah.
I think that might feel like a dopamine hit. Some people as well, when they're doing that, and this might be the experience, everything else is blocked out. So it's like any experience that kind of captures your full attention, even though it's not a very positive one or helpful, because it doesn't give you the answers. You're not worrying about anything else when you're worrying about that. So in a weird way, that can be a soothing thing again. So I would say that's what's happening. And how do you stop it? You need to lean in and catch yourself.
Yeah.
It's like if I'm picking, and that's the thing I'm doing, I need to catch myself picking, know that that's what I'm doing, and you need to have the awareness, accept that it's going to happen, but you almost, like I would say to a client, reverse out of that cul-de-sac. You've gone down there, or circle the hole, don't get into it. You know what's down there.
Yeah,
you know you could easily get in there, you know it's there, you know you're going to do this. Just circle it and go, I'm going to think about something else. And just know you are going to go back to it, but then you're like a child, you'll gently move yourself on. Not horribly, but you need to be pretty as vigilant as you are about looking for the things that make you vulnerable and reject you. You be as vigilant, trying to catch yourself, and then you use the ADHD brain to help you reprogram yourself. That's what I would suggest, and just being mindful, being aware, and not telling yourself perhaps that it is working. You know, the dopamine hit thing, because I think that kind of makes it more attractive in a way. You kind of go, no, it's nice, even though you know it's not. Maybe reframing it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm fascinated by all this because in my head it's like I'm trying to pick it all apart because, and I'm not saying that this person isn't having this experience, by the way, at all. Yeah. But dopamine is your reward chemical. So you get it, you're when you're doing things you enjoy, you get rewarded with dopamine. So I'm not sure what this is, because if the person's being rewarded then, and it's a negative experience, then I would be pulling that apart, which is, well, what is it about this you find pleasurable? And that might sound like a massive contradiction, but if it's given them some kind of reinforcement, and I think kind of false reinforcement actually, around things that are negative, then I think that's a problem actually, because it's negative reinforcement as opposed to positive reinforcement. But if the negative reinforcement is making them feel something positive, then that is a problem.
You latch on to negative thoughts purely for stimulation, even though you know that they're bad and you have that awareness that they're not good for you, you're thinking about them because they're taking you away from the boredom.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's because it takes you away from the boredom necessarily.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I think it can be a bit addictive, perhaps. It's a bit like self-harm.
Yeah.
I mean, physical self-harm can release an endorphin or a kind of pain release. So and the thoughts aren't probably doing that, but there may be an element of, again, the reinforcing of that behavior. It may be associated. Sometimes it will feel like it's the thoughts to the person, but if I talk to some people, they might be doing that rumination in a particular place that feels comforting and safe. So actually, it's not the thinking, that's the unpleasant bit, the being in private, the being not exposed. And so it kind of gets confused. But if you broke it down, you could go to your bedroom or whatever other place you're doing it in, or the gym, and not do the thinking. It would be much more pleasurable.
Yeah.
But also, I think what is better about that, what is it stopping you from experiencing and feeling? That must be bigger for this to be better than that.
Yeah.
Is that
Totally. And I think the other piece of that is if the person's sitting thinking and they're trying to problem solve, then so if they're sitting there thinking, well, I want to solve that problem, then I could understand then if they get the dopamine hit, because you get rewarded when you solve the problem. It feels good. You're like, I'll figure that out. But so that could possibly be it. So it's not necessarily kind of rumination around kind of the reinforcing the negative. If they're trying to problem solve, then you would get a dopamine hit when you've solved the problem because your brain's rewarding you because now you have a solution. So
Do you get a dopamine hit from the fact that you have brought yourself out of a state of boredom? So you have, in a sense, improved your situation, even if that new state is negative.
any shift in stasis will do something.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
And I think it's how we label or interpret certain feelings. Because, you know, a lot of the time if I'm working with someone, they're kind of feeling very stressed or anxious about presenting on a big project, a lot of the time I'll be going, well, the butterflies that you're feeling and the kind of heightened adrenaline, it's the same as if you're terrified, but there's also excitement in there. So again, it's that kind of, we need to relabel them, and there may be some fear, but it's not 100%. So sometimes if you're that change of state may be preferable, it doesn't mean it's better.
Yeah.
But if you appraise it as better, then it will be something you label as better.
Totally. I think it depends too on maybe, like, you know, if we talk about kind of child psychology, where like if a child is looking for attention, then it will use negative attention to get attention. So it will start to break things or to be maybe a bit more destructive. But what it's actually needing is attention, but it's using negative attention to get attention. So I would maybe just look at that piece, which is, what do you need?
Yeah.
Are you needing, is it stimulation, or are you looking for attention? Are you looking for somebody to kind of validate you? Are you feeling kind of vulnerable in that moment? Because certainly, I know with my adolescent patients with ADHD, sometimes if they are seeking stimulation but also seeking attention, then they will say something outrageous in the middle of the classroom. But it's coming from a place in that moment, which is they need something in that moment, which then leads to that that action. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Joe, people that don't get affected by rejection, are they sociopaths or are they just confident?
That's a question. Sociopaths.
I don't think they're either necessarily. I mean, yes, you may have, as a sociopath, that feature that you don't fear or experience or even perceive something as a rejection. But I know that confident people will also experience rejection. It may just be in smaller, more specific areas or ways. So it won't be so debilitating. I think when you are confident and you can self-validate and appraise and have perspective, it affects you much less than obviously this dysregulation and the sensitivity and the amplified. But no, I think that very confident people will have confidence and, fear rejection or not like rejection. It's the way it impacts that's the difference. And a lot of people aren't going to be sharing it as a major feature. People can be quite rational about it. They're going,
Yeah.
So again, it's the perspective piece. I don't know if I've answered that question, but for me, it's a matter of degree and proportion, frequency and intensity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mark, do you think RSD sometimes can be so sensitive that it can realm into the arena of paranoia?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I do think that, because the thing with paranoia is that's obviously, you see that in some presentations like OCD, right? There can be quite a bit of paranoia. But paranoia is an expectation or a sense where there's a lot of threat in your environment, that there's an expectation of rejection or something bad happening. So if we bring some of the features of ADHD into that space, so overthinking, RSD, rumination. So if that snowballs and then the person then ends up in a very kind of dysregulated place with their thoughts, because once the feelings dysregulate, then the thoughts are going to dysregulate. And then once the thoughts dysregulate, they're going to feed the dysregulated feelings. So what can happen there is that then the combination of that can change how the person perceives the world, or how they expect the world is going to actually play out. So that can lead to kind of loads of predictive thinking. And that's essentially what paranoia is. It's an expectation of how things are going to work out, but it's all negative. So absolutely, yeah.
Very personalised, isn't it? So the two people in the room having a chat.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're talking about you.
It's all about you again.
And not because you think you're great. It's because you think they're plotting.
Totally. Yeah.
And maybe not something sinister.
It's all
but,
irrational. Totally.
Yeah.
And a big question for you, Joe, and I suppose separated into two, in the moment, in the short term and perhaps longer term strategies, how do we manage RSD?
I think it's quite a few different things. Some things will be more accessible to some people than others. But first of all, it's like you were saying earlier, Mark, it's noticing that it's happening and it isn't necessarily factual. Yeah. What you're feeling is separate. We all get rejected. We all fail things, don't get chosen, don't do a good enough job sometimes. That's not you. So really working at that level. And what a lot of people with RSD is absolutely avoid it. They don't know how to break it down and actually verify it. What am I actually really thinking is going on here? Why? Sometimes we don't need to know the why, but sometimes they're going, this is a thing I do that happens to me, so I'm scanning. And you really try and understand it rather than run away from it, because it's so aversive and horrific that people don't want to sit with it. You try and have to do that outside of the activation. The other thing I think is really important is in that moment, obviously everything shuts down, but it's being felt. We need to really show ourselves kindness and compassion in those moments, because it's a very healing opportunity, or we can do more damage. And a lot of the time, we don't respond to our most fundamental basic needs. Even just stroking ourselves in those situations, even just going to go, it's okay that you're having this reaction. You haven't done anything wrong. It's going to happen. Just soothing yourself by whichever means, hopefully healthily, rather than through alcohol or some harm. And that's got to be something you probably do for a long time, because it's so deeply embedded in your experience and responses. And then it's about knowing your triggers. And for me, I kind of say to train my clients to go, it's a bit like the canary in the coal mine. If someone doesn't tune into their early signs, so the pancake is the end game where it all goes off. But if I speak to my clients, I'll be going, well, how are you feeling? Well, I didn't sleep very well. And there was that thing the other day, and then my wife said that. They're all early warning signals. Your adrenaline's pumping already, but you're so used to it, you're not tuning into it. So a lot of the work that I'm doing with my clients is really knowing those physiological shifts and changes. So at the earliest time, they can go, right, I need to step out of this when it's not even in a situation where they're going to be rejected. So they're not primed physically with all the stress hormones. Slow down. Leave time between meetings. You're much more likely to interpret things in a heightened state in a more extreme way. So you've got to really tune in. So that, for me, is a really big fundamental part, making sure you're getting enough sleep. We distort stuff.
Are there any micro changes that someone might want to be aware of when they are experiencing those, I suppose, mini triggers that would be in the lead up to the main trigger, in my case, the pancakes. But you said that's often the sort of climatic event. Before then, there's lots of mini. During those mini triggers, what physiological, psychological micro changes could someone recognize to be aware that they are experiencing that and they need to take a step back, take a break?
There's loads, isn't there? There really is loads.
It's knowing yours is the trick. And we're so kind of used to them. So it might be that you're clenching your jaw, if you're a jaw clencher. I will say to clients, where's your tongue? Is it at the roof of your mouth? Relax it. If that's been stuck to the roof of your mouth for hours, you are already primed.
Or the frowning.
Yeah.
Stop. Like, you're massively frowning. Yes, you're frowning.
And if you're in a bad mood this morning when your train was late, that's okay. But actually don't dismiss that and don't not address that you're already running on a bit of, nerve. Just leave that there. And then it doesn't kind of roll on throughout the day. So, and I think as well, a lot of people, when I'm working with them, they'll go, actually, yes, I feel like I've worked a lot recently. I'm working really long days and I've been feeling really low or exhausted. That needs to stop weeks before. Take a rest, come back recharged. You're still going to have a heavy workload, but people are working on empty. And then that's confirming that they're not doing as good a job. They're not going as far. So you've got to really go to basics. You can't run like a professional athlete without the right conditions. So they're the things that we need. You're hungry. If you had a glass of water today. A lot of my clients will say to me, I've literally sat at my desk since I woke up at 7:30 this morning and I've not gone to the bathroom yet. And I'm like,
or haven't eaten. It's like midday. You're like, okay, well.
And then you kind of feel like you're eating really put upon and then someone says the wrong thing and then,
you're hangry.
So it just lessens it. It doesn't cure it, but it does kind of allow you to be more rational, maintain perspective, not jump to the worst conclusion because you're, exhausted so knowing yourself.
Very helpful.
We actually have a psychological term for that. It's called attunement. So literally like that, where you tune in, like Joe was saying, where you tune in and you really understand yourself. Because unfortunately, most of us tune out. Like we're not tuning in. We're not listening to the cues from our body. And the body is amazing because it's a biofeedback system. So if you're thirsty, you're going to know. If you're hungry, you're going to know. If you're tired, you're going to know. If there's a pain in your leg, you're going to know. Your body's going to give you all the feedback.
All the data you need.
But if we're not practicing attunement, or we're not tuning in, then we're tuned out. Which means we're going to, like what you were saying, Alex, we're going to miss all the cues. But actually, when we slow it down, all the cues were screaming at you, but you just weren't listening.
I've said this before. I often have to transfer data from my camera to my laptop through a USB stick. And when I stop safely ejecting the USB stick, when I start yanking it out of my computer, an early sign of that frustration, of that burnout.
Good achievement.
I'll say do your self-check-in.
When I start
Every day
ordering more
throughout the day.
takeaways.
So takeaways.
Mark, do you have any advice for someone who wants to stop obsessively reflecting on mistakes they've made in the past?
Yeah, there's a I'm probably going to butcher this now. Hopefully I won't. There's a great quote by Buddha that says, you can only lose what you cling to. And what that means is that the more we spend time in the past, the more we lose in the moment. And that is so true. And especially with RSD, we're all in our heads, we're not in the moment. Like when I talk to some of my patients, we're dealing with, like, I'll often say, well, when did that happen? And 9 months ago. And I'm like, but they're so in the past and in the moment, they're feeling all the stuff of 9 months, and we have 9 months of rumination, 9 months of that getting stored in their brain. So all that time, all those months were like massively affected by something that wasn't dealt with and kind of left in the past. So like, obviously it's easier said than done, but you have to let it go. And letting it go is a choice. It's a choice. And choosing to let something go, it has a dramatic impact on the present, but also on how you're going to future-proof yourself. And I'll often say that to my patients is one of the problems with the issues with ADHD is because of the difficulty with executive functioning in the prefrontal cortex, future-focused thinking is very hard because it's all kind of happening in a moment. But actually, again, if we just kind of take a moment and think, well, like, what's the tomorrow version of you going to think of this? Or the week down the road version of you going to think of it. So it's trying to project it into the future in terms of protecting the future and future-proofing it. Whereas if you bring all this stuff with you, then you're going to damage your present moment, but you're also going to damage your future. And that's a high price to pay for bringing all that stuff with you. And also it's the knock-on effect around your mental health and the people in your life and your relationships. So it's a high price to pay. Yeah.
And it's interesting because when you're working with your patients, you can teach them and guide them through that process. Because a lot of people go, well, how do I do that? Because if it was that easy, we would do it, wouldn't we? But I think that there's no getting away from the fact that you've got to do the work. The work doesn't have to be with a therapist or a coach or a psychiatrist, but it does need to be leaning in and going, that's what's going on here.
Understand.
And a lot of the time that's so aversive because it's so painful that actually we're avoiding it, but experiencing it in worse and worse and worse terms. So if people kind of are scared to do it, I'd say it's preferable because you're experiencing pain and distress on a regular basis. So confronting it, it won't have more power, it will have less power. And it's going to take time. But you will grow in confidence to be able to deal with those things by addressing each of those triggers and then pulling the thread and going back. It's not meant to be easy. If it wouldn't be so debilitating and profound if it was just something simple, would it?
Totally. I think that's a brilliant point as well. Like if you're going to deal with it, you can't avoid discomfort. But if you're taking it with you, like you're in discomfort anyway, but there's actually no relief. Whereas if you actually deal with the discomfort and work through it, then you get relief. So there's actually something very positive about the discomfort. But if you're avoiding the discomfort, you're not actually avoiding the discomfort. You're avoiding dealing with what you perceive is going to be too much. That's going to be too painful for me. I won't be able to cope. You actually can. But again, because you don't build up those skills, because you're not doing it, then you avoid it because you think it's going to be too much for you. But actually, it's not, because I often say to my patients, there's a big difference between something being uncomfortable and unbearable. Uncomfortable is uncomfortable, unbearable is unbearable. But sometimes we confuse the things as it's unbearable. But is it? Let's actually break that down. Is it unbearable or is it uncomfortable? And so you're reframing that so the person can walk towards it, because what they've spent forever doing is walking away from it.
And build the confidence that those feelings, because they are feelings in that moment, and you might need to do that with safety and someone around you, but I will do it with a client sometimes in the room. Feelings have a rhythm to them.
Yeah, they're
temporary and they will peak. It's like a wave. Okay, that wave may be huge. If you never let yourself experience the peak of the wave because you're distracting, whether it be on your phone, self-medicating, doing something, ruminating over something that's less painful than that, you don't know that you can handle that peak. And then it will go peak. And it might be another one coming behind. But once you start to know you can surf it, or you bob up, even if you've been floored by it, then you can kind of go, I don't have to run from this. It's very unpleasant, but I can do this. And you build resilience. And you don't have to fear putting yourself in situations that you may experience rejection or humiliation, because you will potentially, and you will certainly find it if you're looking for it. But you can handle it.
Totally.
Despite the unpleasant, rather.
Yeah.
Truly fascinating. And thank you both very much. A final question for both of you. I'll start with Joe. Is there anything you would like to ask Mark?
Oh my God, not that we could film tonight, because I've got so many things that I would love
in general,
to tap into. No, I think that, before I came and we were talking, there were things that I would have loved to have asked, but I think we've kind of covered those off, because I'm really curious in the adolescent experience. And for me, I think we've covered a lot of that.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's so much more that I would just love to learn, but not one specific question. So I'm just going to say thank you.
Likewise.
For
Yeah, I loved it.
expanding my understanding. And I've really, really enjoyed the
Me
discussion.
too. Yeah, I feel like it was like CPD. Hey?
Yeah, it's great. We'll log it.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic! And on behalf of all the listeners who I know, do battle RSD very often on the daily, a big thank you to both of you. We have a closing tradition on the podcast where I deliver a letter to you, and I deliver it to both of you.
Oh, fabulous. Green postbox, very Irish.
Yes, it's the same colour. It's the right colour. Isn't it?
Their postbox in Ireland are green.
It's a letter from the previous guest where they have written 3 rules. I'll give it to you, Jay. 3 rules to live by. And if you could read those rules out.
So, 3 rules to live by. Always take time to ponder the meaning of life. You don't always have to be right. Very true.
True.
Be willing to fail. Don't avoid risks. They are often not as bad as you imagine. Super true.
Very wise.
There we go.
Yeah.
Wise words.
Wise words.
Joe, Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers, Alex. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.